In Bonanza, Adam and Hoss Cartwright were brothers who couldn't have been more different. Adam was the serious, well-educated architect, while Hoss was the gentle giant with a heart of gold. But the differences between their characters didn't just stop on screen. Behind the scenes, the men who played them, Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker, were worlds apart too. Pernell was outspoken and often clashed with the show's creators, while Dan, despite loving his role, struggled with the fame that came along with it. Their lives took very different turns, and when Dan passed away suddenly at just 43, Pernell made a choice no one expected. He didn't attend the funeral. But why? Was there lingering bitterness, unspoken grief, or something deeper at play? Let's find out. Before they became household names, both men had unique journeys that eventually led them to Bonanza. Their early years shaped who they were, and understanding that might just help explain why their paths diverged so dramatically later on. Pernell Roberts was born to be on the stage. His love for acting wasn't something he stumbled into. It was a passion that burned in him from the very beginning. In 1949, he took his first big leap into the world of theater at the Olney Theater in Maryland. There he was, young and ambitious, sharing the stage with big names like Moss Hart and Kitty Carlisle in The Man Who Came to Dinner. That role was just the start, but it was clear even then that Pernell had something special, and he didn't slow down. Pernell took on a variety of roles, each one showing off his versatility. He played Dan in Night Must Fall and Alfred Doolittle in Pygmalion, switching from dramatic to comedic with ease. You could tell he wasn't just talented. He was driven, always pushing for more, always hungry for roles that challenged him. By 1952, Pernell was ready for bigger opportunities, so he did what many aspiring actors dream of. He moved to New York City. The city was buzzing with theater life in the 50s, and Pernell dove right in. He worked off-Broadway, performing in everything from one-act operas to Shakespearean plays. Can you see him in your mind, bringing Mercutio to life in Romeo and Juliet, or brooding as Macbeth? Audiences loved him, and critics took notice too. In 1955, Pernell's performance as Macbeth earned him a Drama Desk Award, a huge accomplishment that solidified his place in the theater world. But Pernell wasn't one to stick to just one thing. While classical theater remained his first love, he branched out, performing in plays like Twelfth Night and The Merchant of Venice, always bringing his unique touch to the stage. But as much as he loved the stage, television was calling. Pernell made his small-screen debut in 1956 on Kraft Television Theater. If you were flipping through the channels back then, you might have caught him in shows like Whirlybirds or Cheyenne. He was becoming a familiar face to TV audiences, even as he continued to juggle film, television, and theater work. By 1957, Pernell had landed a contract with Columbia Pictures, and his film career began to take off. One of his first major movie roles came in 1958's Desire Under the Elms, where he played one of Burl Ives's sons. Pernell had a knack for portraying complex, layered characters, and it was clear he was destined for more than just supporting roles. While Pernell was building his acting career on the East Coast, Dan Blocker's life was unfolding in a completely different way. Dan wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to end up in Hollywood. Standing 6'4", and weighing over 300 pounds, he was hard to miss, but he had a soft, gentle soul. Before he even considered acting, Dan was drafted into the Army during the Korean War. Serving as an infantry sergeant, he faced the harsh realities of combat and was even awarded a Purple Heart for his bravery. Those experiences left a mark on him, shaping the kindness and quiet strength he later brought to his role as Hoss Cartwright. After returning from the war, Dan found himself drawn to acting. It wasn't a straight shot to stardom for him, though. In 1957, he landed a small role in a Three Stooges short called Outer Space Jitters. It's a funny thought seeing the future Hoss Cartwright in a slapstick comedy, but Dan had a great sense of humor and wasn't afraid to poke fun at himself. From there, he started picking up roles in some of TV's most popular westerns of the time. He made appearances on shows like Gunsmoke, Cheyenne, and The Rifleman, usually playing tough, rugged characters that fit his imposing frame. But Dan wasn't just a big guy with a tough exterior. He brought a warmth to his roles that made him stand out. One of his more memorable early performances was as a rodeo performer in Richard Diamond, Private Detective. Whether he was playing a blacksmith, bartender, or cattleman, Dan had a way of making his characters feel real, relatable, and human. By the late 1950s, Pernell and Dan were on a collision course, even though they didn't know it yet. Pernell had become a respected actor, bouncing between Broadway, television, and film. He had a reputation for being serious about his craft, always seeking roles that allowed him to dig deep and explore complex characters. In 1959, he starred in Ride Lonesome, playing a conflicted outlaw opposite Randolph Scott. Critics loved his performance, calling it one of the best of his career. It showcased Pernell's ability to bring depth and nuance to even the grittiest of roles. Meanwhile, Dan was finding his niche in the world of westerns. He had the ruggedness the genre demanded, but he also brought a sensitivity that made him unique. Around the same time Pernell was making waves in film, Dan had a role in the pilot episode of The Rebel, playing a troubled rancher. It wasn't a huge part, but it showed his ability to inject vulnerability into tough, larger-than-life characters. And then came Bonanza. In 1959, television was filled with westerns, but none quite like this. David Dortort, the show's creator, wanted something different, something more than just dusty shootouts and cowboy cliches. He was building a family drama set in the Wild West, a story about fathers and sons, loyalty, and doing the right thing in a complicated world. To make that vision work, he needed actors who weren't just good. They had to bring something unique to the table. And that's where Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker came in. Pernell, with his classical theater background and commanding presence, was a natural fit for Adam Cartwright, the eldest son. Adam was sharp, educated, and thoughtful, the kind of guy who could design a homestead from scratch and argue philosophy in the same breath. Pernell brought a seriousness to the role that made Adam feel real. You could believe he'd traveled the world, studied architecture, and still found his way back to the family ranch. Dan, on the other hand, was cast as Hoss Cartwright, the gentle giant with a heart as big as his frame. Dortort saw something special in Dan. Hoss wasn't just the comic relief or the muscle of the family, he was the emotional core. Audiences needed to fall in love with him, to see beyond his size and into his kind soul. Dan made that happen effortlessly. His warmth radiated from the screen, and it wasn't long before Hoss became one of the show's most beloved characters. When Bonanza hit the airwaves, it stood out right away. This wasn't just another western about gunfights and outlaws. Sure, there were plenty of action-packed episodes, but at its heart, Bonanza was about family. The Cartwrights weren't just ranchers. They were a symbol of unity, strength, and moral integrity in a time and place where doing the right thing wasn't always easy. And viewers couldn't get enough. But while the show found its audience, life behind the scenes wasn't as smooth as it looked on screen. Pernell Roberts had high hopes when he joined Bonanza. Adam Cartwright was a complex character, the intellectual of the family, always thinking ahead, always the voice of reason. But as the seasons went on, Pernell started feeling boxed in. Week after week he wore the same costume, stood on the same sets, and delivered lines that felt, to him, repetitive and shallow. For someone who came from the vibrant world of theater, where every role was a fresh challenge, this routine felt stifling. It didn't take long for Pernell's frustrations to boil over. He began criticizing the show openly, calling it junk television. He believed Bonanza was wasting its potential, focusing on simple, feel-good stories instead of tackling serious social issues like racism and injustice. To Pernell, the show was playing it too safe. He famously quipped that working on Bonanza felt like Isaac Stern sitting in with Lawrence Welk, a dig that showed just how out of place he felt. But what really got under Pernell's skin was the way the show handled family dynamics. Adam Cartwright was a grown man in his 30s, yet he constantly had to defer to his father, Ben Cartwright, played by Lorne Greene. Pernell thought it was ridiculous. In interviews, he called the relationship adolescent, arguing that it didn't make sense for three adult men to be so dependent on their father. He wanted Adam to have more independence, more depth, and more meaningful storylines. But the producers had a formula that worked, and they weren't about to change it. While Pernell wrestled with his dissatisfaction, Dan Blocker embraced his role with open arms. Hoss Cartwright was more than just a character to Dan. It was an extension of his own personality. Hoss was the heart of the show, the guy who always had a smile, always lent a hand, and always stood up for the little guy. Dan played him with a philosophy that was simple but powerful. We shall pass this way on earth but once. If there is any kindness we can show, let us do it now. And that kindness shone through in every scene. Dan's portrayal of Hoss made him a fan favorite, and his easygoing nature made him a joy to work with on set. He didn't chase the spotlight, and he wasn't interested in Hollywood glamour. Dan loved the work but kept his personal life private, retreating from the public eye whenever he could. But even with their different approaches to fame and the show, Pernell and Dan found themselves facing a shared challenge in 1962. While filming an episode called The Dowry, the two were involved in a serious accident. They were riding horses downhill on a muddy trail when Pernell's horse stumbled and fell. Dan, riding close behind, couldn't stop in time and went down too. Both men tried to leap clear, but they weren't quick enough. Pernell ended up with a sprained neck, while Dan suffered a broken collarbone and a separated shoulder. The injuries were no joke. The production team had to scramble, rewriting scripts to accommodate Dan's arm, which had to be in a sling during filming. But the physical pain wasn't the only thing that lingered. For Pernell, already disillusioned with the show, the accident felt like one more reason to leave. Critics speculated that the incident might have been the final straw for him, and they weren't far off. Though he stayed on Bonanza for a few more seasons, his heart was no longer in it. Behind the scenes, the dynamic between the cast grew more complicated. Pernell's outspoken nature didn't sit well with the show's producers or even some of his co-stars. He wasn't afraid to voice his opinions, even if it caused tension on set. He wanted Bonanza to be more than just a popular Western. He wanted it to have substance. But not everyone shared his vision. Dan, by contrast, was the peacemaker. His humor, warmth, and down-to-earth personality made him beloved among the cast and crew. He didn't get involved in the behind-the-scenes drama, preferring to focus on his work and keeping things lighthearted on set. Even though Dan and Pernell were very different, they respected each other professionally. They weren't best friends, but they had a working relationship that brought Adam and Hoss to life in a way that connected deeply with audiences. As Bonanza continued to dominate TV screens, Pernell's frustrations finally reached a breaking point. In 1965, after 6 seasons, he made the bold decision to leave the show. He wanted to return to roles that challenged him, stories that made him feel excited to act again. It was a risky move. Bonanza was one of the most popular television shows, and walking away meant stepping out of the spotlight. But Pernell didn't care. He couldn't keep playing a character that felt stagnant, one that didn't give him the space to grow as an actor. When Pernell left, the show explained Adam Cartwright's absence by saying he had moved away. It was a simple explanation, and the character was mentioned from time to time in later episodes, but Pernell never returned. He was done with Bonanza, at least professionally. Meanwhile, Dan Blocker remained a cornerstone of the show. While Pernell was off exploring new acting opportunities, Dan continued to bring warmth, humor, and heart to Hoss Cartwright. Fans adored him, and it wasn't hard to see why. Hoss was the kind of character you couldn't help but root for, a big man with an even bigger heart. Dan embraced his role fully, both on and off the screen, but Dan didn't just stick to Bonanza. He ventured into movies too, starring in films like Come Blow Your Horn with Frank Sinatra. And he wasn't afraid to try his hand at business either. Along with some partners, he helped launch a chain of Bonanza Steakhouse restaurants. Using his fame as Hoss, Dan promoted the brand, appearing in commercials and even visiting the restaurants himself. It was a clever move, showing how much he embraced his Bonanza fame while staying true to his down-to-earth nature. Even though Pernell had his issues with the show, Bonanza wasn't afraid to tackle serious topics from time to time. Episodes like Enter Thomas Bowers took on racism head-on, which was groundbreaking for a TV Western in the 1960s. In that episode, Hoss protects an African-American opera singer from prejudice in Virginia City, showing the Cartwrights' unwavering stance against injustice. Other episodes like The Fear Merchants and The Wish also explored themes of inequality and discrimination. These storylines pushed the boundaries of what a Western could do, but for Pernell, it still wasn't enough. He believed the show could dive deeper, tackle tougher issues, and offer more meaningful stories. But when it didn't, he made his exit. Dan, however, stayed until the very end. He loved playing Hoss, and it showed in every episode. But in 1972, tragedy struck. Dan Blocker passed away suddenly at just 43 years old following complications from gallbladder surgery. His death sent shockwaves through Hollywood and left the Bonanza cast heartbroken. Dan wasn't just the heart of the show. He was the heart off-screen, too. His warmth, kindness, and humor made him beloved by everyone who worked with him. Fans were devastated, and so were his co-stars. Michael Landon, who played Little Joe, later said that he would think about Dan's death whenever he needed to cry during a scene. That's how deeply his loss was felt. The producers of Bonanza faced a tough decision after Dan's passing. Instead of recasting Hoss or quietly writing him out, they did something groundbreaking for television at the time. They acknowledged his death on the show. They didn't go into detail, but the absence of Hoss was felt in the story, and the Cartwright family grieved just as much as the audience did. It was a powerful moment in TV history and a testament to how much Dan meant to the show. But amidst the grief and the tributes, one absence stood out. Pernell Roberts didn't attend Dan Blocker's funeral. Fans were stunned. How could Adam Cartwright not show up to say goodbye to his on-screen brother? Over the years, people have speculated about why Pernell wasn't there. Some believe it had to do with his complicated relationship with Bonanza. Pernell had left the show feeling frustrated and disillusioned. He criticized its writing, its lack of depth, and the direction it had taken. Maybe those lingering feelings made it hard for him to reconnect with that part of his life, even for something as significant as Dan's funeral. Others think it might have been more personal. Pernell was known for being a private man, someone who didn't like public displays of emotion. Dan's funeral wasn't just a family affair, it was a public event, with fans, reporters, and cameras all around. For someone like Pernell, who avoided the spotlight when he could, attending might have felt overwhelming. He may have believed that grieving in his own way, away from the public eye, was more respectful. There's also the possibility that Pernell simply struggled with grief. He was known to be introspective, even brooding at times. He once referred to himself as Pernell the Last One Roberts after his Bonanza co-stars had passed, a darkly humorous nod to outliving them all. That kind of mindset suggests someone who carried the weight of those losses deeply, even if he didn't always show it outwardly. Despite his absence at the funeral, Pernell spoke fondly of Dan Blocker in later years. He described him as kind, generous, and impossible not to like. While they may not have been close friends, there was clear respect between them. Pernell's decision not to attend the funeral wasn't about bitterness. It was more likely about how he processed loss. Dan's funeral itself became the subject of strange rumors over time. One of the most persistent stories claimed that he was buried in a piano box because of his large size. But that wasn't true. Dan was laid to rest in a simple family plot in Texas, alongside his parents and sister. It was a quiet, dignified farewell for a man who had always shied away from the spotlight. Dan's death marked the beginning of the end for Bonanza. The show struggled to recover without him. The 14th and final season was its least popular, and fans felt the absence of Hoss deeply. Michael Landon later admitted that losing Dan was like losing the soul of the show. It just wasn't the same without him. As for Pernell, he found success again in the late 1970s, starring in Trapper John, Maryland, where he played a seasoned doctor in a hospital drama. It was a role that allowed him to stretch his acting skills and explore more complex stories, the kind of work he had always wanted. But no matter where his career took him, Bonanza remained a defining part of his legacy. Even though Pernell had his issues with the show, and even though he didn't attend Dan's funeral, the bond between them, as actors, as co-stars, as part of something bigger than themselves, couldn't be erased. Their performances, their dynamic, and their contributions to Bonanza left a lasting mark on television history. Decades later, we still remember Adam and Hoss Cartwright, not just because of the stories they told, but because of the heart and soul that Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker brought to those roles. They may have had their differences, but together they helped create something timeless. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on more deep dives into classic and modern TV stories. And let us know in the comments, what's your favorite Bonanza episode or memory? We'd love to hear from you.